Welcome. I'm Thomas Carothers, Senior Vice President at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and it's my pleasure to be your host today at this session on the crises of global order. Hardly needs saying that the question of the international liberal order, does it still exist? Will it continue in the future? Is very much upon us. That's because of events in recent years, starting in the United States with a shift in American foreign policy away from that concept towards a very different idea about America's place in the world and what sort of world America should strive for, but also events in the world all around, the troubles that democracy is having in many regions, the success of a number of authoritarian regimes in projecting power, have raised basic questions about whether this concept is still relevant. Is it still the way we should organize our thinking about global order? And of course, with the presidential transition imminent, question is even more relevant when we think about the basic choices that President-elect Biden and his team will make when they come to power about how to recast American foreign policy in ways that will be both productive, but also relating to past traditions of American foreign policy. To discuss this, we're really fortunate to have with us today John Ikenberry. John is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University, and he has invested more time and thought and care into this topic of international liberal order than anybody I know. And he's written a great new book, A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism and the Liberal Internationalism and the Crises of Global Order. I think I got it right, John.
That's right.
And so we're going to hear from John, but we're also really fortunate to have with us Kori Schake, who's the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute. She's a prominent and widely respected scholar, commentator, and thinker about international affairs, and she's worked previously in the government in various positions, as well as with other universities and institutes like the Hoover Institution. So we're delighted to have Kori with us as well. Here's how we're going to proceed. I've asked John to, give us the 10-minute version of what's really a thoughtful and deep book, and that's impossible, of course, but he'll hit some highlights. I'm going to ask Kori then to react, and the two of them, I'm going to draw them out a bit and see if we get a conversation going around some of the core issues. Then along the way, I'll start to look for questions. I'll note that, and we're open to questions, and then try to bring your questions into the discussion as well. John, without further ado, please go ahead.
Thank you, Tom, and it's great to be on this panel with you, even if it's virtual. And Kori, thank you so much for joining in as well. It's great to see both of you and to have a chance to talk about the big issues in the context of this book. The book began as a series of lectures at the University of Virginia in November of 2016, the week after the last presidential election. It's fair to say I had a fairly subdued audience as I was talking about the future of liberal internationalism. And it was really at that point, and then the following 4 years, that led to this book. And the topic was what is the future of liberal internationalism? But in many ways, that question led me to the past and to try to wrestle with what we all see in front of us today, a kind of breakdown of order, a kind of ending or crisis of the US-led post-war system, a kind of world historical moment when the big issues are on the table again, the future of liberal democracy, the future of a coherent cooperative order, the questions about the balancing of capitalism and liberalism and democracy, which are all kind of in tension with each other and perhaps out of balance more than they've been in a generation or two. And the question of the future of liberal internationalism as a way of organizing the world, the cooperative organization of the international system. And the question I really ask in this book is, on what ground, politically and intellectually, can liberal internationalism plant its flag? And in doing that, I take the long road. My first move is to look back, observing that liberal international order did not begin in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. It actually didn't begin in 1945. It's a longer tradition that's been with us for over 200 years. And that longer tradition shows itself as a much more contested, close-run, agonistic story of competition between projects, modernity projects, types of systems, great wars and upheavals, and not least, of course, the period of the 1930s and 40s, which for me has been kind of a touchstone in writing this book, going back and looking at the Roosevelt era, what was, I think, understood at that time as a near extinction moment for liberal democracy, more than any other moment, really. And in some sense, today's moment looks as much like that, not quite, but similar than any other moment. In writing this book, I had a particular a book that inspired me. Many books did, many authors, many encounters, but Ira Katznelson's Desolation and Enlightenment, which is a book that looks at the generation, I'll call it the 1945 generation, that in their own adult lifetime, they saw the ravages of the world occur like it had not ever occurred before. Total war, the Great Depression, the rise of totalitarianism, the rise of fascism, the Holocaust, and the dropping of the atomic bomb, and all of this in their own lifetime. And yet, as Katznelson shows, what he calls policy liberals find themselves picking up the pieces, trying to, in a pragmatic, practical way, trying to see how they can put back open, rule-based societies again. And in some sense, that's what I am trying to ask of the broader 200 years. And if you were to summarize what I'm trying to do in this book, I would say there are three things. First of all, to show the deep roots of liberal internationalism, to give it a sense of its gravitas as a tradition. We often think about liberals as opposed to realists who have a very grand tradition with thinkers like Kissinger and all the way back. And there are others on the left, but liberal internationalism as a tradition, trying to find its coherence, its lineages, and so forth. Secondly, to try to be honest with its failures and accomplishments. We've been through a very difficult period. Liberal internationalism is not seen in all quarters, and certainly liberal order as something that has succeeded. Some are wishing it a fond farewell, looking for something else. So what can we learn? What kind of usable past can we draw from these successes and failures when we think about the future? And thirdly, to if you will, kind of recover the more world-weary, agonistic side of liberal internationalism. It's not seen across the larger expanse as really a tradition of triumphant march to a better future. It doesn't necessarily entail an assumption that the stack of history is decked in favor of the deck is stacked in favor of liberal democracy. It's a more contested matter, and democracies have to think about how they organize themselves. And so I guess the next thing I'd say is, well, what precisely is liberal internationalism? And here, there's not an obvious answer. As Tacitus said about the Roman Empire, it's rich in vicissitudes. It's got a lot there, and trying to distinguish its lineages and its phases and its strands is actually a lot of what the work of this book was. But I think it's fair to say that when people think about liberal internationalism, they think of Wilson's famous phrase that he uttered in his war address to Congress in 1917, when he said that the war was going to be conducted to make the world safe for democracy. And that has been understood across the generations as a kind of rallying call, a kind of idealist call to push democracy out into the world, to all corners. Whereas I really start this book by saying we can read that phrase differently, not in that idealist narrative, but as a more pragmatic, literal reading, in which it really is seen as a project to make safe democracies, to create an environment in which democracies can be protected and succeed. And so the book has this language. I try to develop a kind of language of the ecosystem, the environment, the geopolitical space, And that over 200 years, I think, is the larger story of liberal internationalism and order building across successive eras and decades. Why? To manage their mutual interdependence, to reconcile what, as I wrote this book, I became ever more impressed by the inherent, irresolvable tensions at the heart of liberal democracy: liberty and equality, individualism and community, sovereignty and interdependence. It's a never-ending invitation to struggle over how to reconcile things that can never be fully reconciled. And that creating a container in which democracies do that together, because they do it better when they are organized collectively. And then, of course, the more geostrategic goal of creating a zone of cooperation for trade and security. So there's a lot of work that liberal democracies do together, and it's built around convictions that trade and openness, properly managed, is good for all parties, that institutions, multilateral institutions and other kinds facilitate cooperation, that democracies do have special capacities and inclinations to cooperate, particularly among themselves. And then fourthly, in an era of rising economic and security interdependence, which for me really is synonymous with modernity, the rise of the modern era, and cascades of security and economic interdependence, liberal democracies are uniquely vulnerable. Think about it. They are open societies trying to operate in an open system. That duality is almost inconceivable as a structure that has an equilibrium point. But yet, in a context of rising economic and security interdependence, this is the ultimate motivation that these states are better off working together. As Benjamin Franklin said in 1776 to his fellow leaders of the colonies, we will hang together or we will surely hang separately. And so the book goes on to try to trace these different eras, the 19th century rise of internationalism. I try to tell the story of different kinds of internationalism that thread through the 19th century. Free trade, the peace movement, the arbitration movement, social liberal movements, all of them different threads, you might say, that get braided and frayed at different moments across 200 years. Wilson was not an original thinker. He brought those threads of 19th century internationalism together as a project, gave voice to it, and connected it to American power. And then I argue, and in some ways the more I think more interesting part of the book, although I have I think a very clear-eyed view of Wilson, is really the FDR era, where there's really a revolution in internationalism. It's a very different vision of international order in Wilson. And I'll kind of end with this. In Wilson's period, there was a sense that liberal democracy was on the rise, that every country west of Russia in 1920 was some kind of parliamentary system. There was a sense that in that era, as Wilson understood it, the rise of liberal democracy provided an opportunity to create the glue for international order in a new way. And then 25, 30 years later, in the context of the great crises that I talked about earlier, that Katz-Nelson talks about as well, it was in some sense the liberal democracies that were in peril, and it was the international order that would provide the glue to keep the liberal democracies together. So there was really an inversion of what the liberal democratic international order connection was. That's an argument I make in this book, among many others. And just finally, we are, there's a question of what went wrong, and I'm sure we'll get to this in our conversation. But in some sense, that club of democracies that was the genesis, really, of the golden era of the liberal order after World War II was a very important, had a very important logic of conditionality. To join, to be in, was to buy into a suite of responsibilities and to gain things like trade access, international institutional functions. When the Cold War ended, that club lost its coherence, and the bargains and institutions around them weakened, and the club of liberal democracies became an international order where states were not really in anything at that point. It's what I call a kind of shopping mall. It lost its club character. It became something that states, whether they were democracies or countries like a rising China, come in and take advantage of certain aspects of it, like a public utility, and then they leave. And so there was something that was lost even during the moment of triumph. And so the book ends really with, how do we go forward and how do we reconstruct, and in what way can we learn from the past to see if there's one more cycle of liberal democratic success? And
Okay.
I think there is.
We'll come to that, John. But let me give Kori a chance to just chime in with some thoughts here. You've read the book, you've heard John just now. What are some of your impressions, and what are some of the issues that you'd like to delve into that you think are most important?
So I want to start by saying that I love this book. I think it's the best book John Ikenberry has ever written, and that's a hell of a high standard, because he has all by himself carried the banner for liberal internationalism among serious thinkers about the international order. I want to offer 3 praises and 2 challenges to the book. The first is about safety. The thing that struck me really strongly reading the book was how elegantly John used Woodrow Wilson's "Making the World Safe for Democracy" as a lever to shift how we think about that subject, from having the emphasis on democracy to having the emphasis on safety. John writes in the book that Wilson's statement, and especially the international order as the United States envisions it under Franklin Roosevelt and enacts it under Harry Truman and subsequent presidents, is a plea for safety, a belief that the free societies are open societies, they're porous to outside influences, and that creates a vulnerability. And we're seeing that so intensely right now with the way that the free world's adversaries are using gray zone warfare to corrupt our elections, to foster our divisions, and to keep themselves out of accountability for the effects they're creating. So I think it's really important that John emphasizes that liberalism isn't triumphalism. It grows out of fear. It grows out of fear that our societies are uniquely vulnerable, and that the only way to preserve them is not by their individual strength, but by creating institutions and means of cooperation that make those states stronger relative to their challenges. Parenthetically, on this point, I don't think you're fair to Warren Harding and the efforts of the 1920s to create that with the Washington Naval Accords. I think they deserve more. They were an interesting experiment, failed experiment at building liberal order. Second praise is, I think the most important thing John does in the book is show how liberalism is a response to modernity in the way that other systems of thinking about the international order are not. And I want to read a passage from his introduction that I think sums it up really nicely. Liberal internationalism is a cluster of ideas about how to build world order, starting with the liberal democracies, to realize the gains from modernity and to guard against its dangers. I think that's really important, and I've never seen anybody make the argument that that modernity is creating new problems of vulnerabilities of societies and problems of interconnectedness, right? We have global trade now in a way that was unimaginable to Thucydides. And that liberal internationalism struggles into being out of the Enlightenment because we begin to have new problems we have to solve. I think that's a hugely consequential insight that I've never seen anybody make before. Third praise. John connects in this book to an even greater extent than he does in his other work, the domestic character of a state and its international behavior. And this is why all of the other explanations for the international order are insufficient, right? That John shows that liberal internationalism is successful because it's protecting liberal democracy at home. That is, who we are internationally is a macrocosm of the political structures and political culture of liberalism domestically. And we underestimate this all the time. Even now, serious people are having conversations about, will China choose to side with, will Europe choose to side with China or the United States in this great power competition? As though the liberal and free societies of Europe could take sides sustainably over years with a country as illiberal as China. Their own publics aren't going to stand for it, as Volkswagen is about to find out. So that connection is really important. The two challenges I would make. The first is about the role of technology and the absence of community. I think, John, you may have missed a trick by not talking about Bob Putnam and the atomization of liberal societies that is partly cultural, the breakup of families, but it's also partly technological, right? We can listen to our own music. We don't listen to the radio. We can choose an isolated ecosystem. And that's a real challenge for sustaining the community that free societies require. I'd love to hear you reflect more on that. Also, parenthetically, I think you don't give enough credit to Holland in the origins of liberalism. And I think Simon Schama's terrific book, Embarrassment of Riches. When you do the second printing of this book, the second edition of this book, please go back and give credit to Holland for where some of these liberal tendencies begin to be state policy. My last point, the second challenge. I don't agree with you about your conclusion that in its moment of greatest success, something went wrong for liberal internationalism. I genuinely believe nothing went wrong. What happened is the countries, particularly China and Russia, the leadership cannot sustain power if it chooses a liberal path. What you see is the empire striking back. It's not that something went wrong with liberalism, it's the threat liberalism poses to illiberal societies. And if you want proof that the values of liberalism are indeed universal, look at how hard the Chinese government has to work to prevent the Chinese people from having the choice of them. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Kori. John, why don't you pick up her two challenges and respond?
Well, first of all, Kori, you've been very, very kind in your comments, and I really appreciate your 3 points, which in some sense you made more eloquent than I did in my book. I think the point about safety is what I was trying to get at in that reading of Wilson and trying to pull that through the period of the modern period, and you have identified that, and thank you very much, as well as the other points about modernity and character of liberal democracy. I think you asked good questions about technology and about success or failure after the Cold War. So let me just say a word about those. I think the offstage in this book are lots of issues about liberal societies and their travails in the context of technological change, and I don't confront it directly. And I think Putnam is somebody whose work I think is just fundamental to that question. And I agree with you that question is how liberal societies rediscover community and rebind themselves together and reweave themselves and redo the social contract will tell the story, will tell the tale of what the rest of the 21st century will look like, whether there is another liberal democratic age. Because a lot, as you say, of the work is at the domestic level, in the context of technology and shifts in production, in the way in which value chains and social networks whereupon or within information flows. All of this is making it harder and harder for societies to see themselves as one thing, protecting each other, operating in a world where they can both be good to their people at home and good citizens of the larger system. So I don't have a solution. I don't think, I do think that part of it is good old-fashioned policy change. I think that at each of the great eras of internationalism, there's been a kind of progressive movement to share the fruits of modernity with the larger part of our societies, to renegotiate the social contract. What Putnam is really saying, and what I think is a challenge that we all feel intuitively, is that as our societies become more divided, and as our identities seem to be lesser than national identities, but tribal identities and regional identities and all the rest that we see happening across the liberal democratic world, it's harder for people to agree to pay taxes, make compromises, work for the greater good. And I don't have any magic formula for how we get back there, Kori. I do think that is one of the seminal questions of our time. On the post-Cold War era, I do say, to defend myself, that we were the victim of our success, is how I put it. And not in the book, but in a lecture I gave at LSE some years ago, I said it's a Karl Polanyi problem, not an E.H. Carr problem. That is to say, it was a problem of success in that the world society organized around liberal democracies that had won the Cold War sort of mobilized itself and spread to all corners, and thereby undermine governance mechanisms. I think it's a failure that is not a failure of liberal democracy. Indeed, obviously, it was the last system standing. There was really, in some sense, no alternative to a kind of expanding world of liberal democracy, because Russia was enfeebled and delegitimated as a modernity project, and China had not yet begun its great march. And beyond that, there was a real kind of moral quality to the post-Cold War expansion. People who had been under the thumb of authoritarian or communist states wanted freedom and wanted to be connected to EU or to NATO or to these kind of more diffuse systems of cooperation. And in some sense, and this will be my last point, that kind of expansion of the liberal promise to more people is at the heart of the DNA of liberal democracy. Each of our societies, not least the United States, began with a very incomplete liberal democracy, not least in the American case, slavery. That was really the project, the original sin that has never fully been overcome, but in successive steps in different ways has. And so too, expansion of the franchise and so forth to women, and the qualitative expansion of what we think our society should deliver to us, and what we want to deliver to each other. All of this is a story of unfolding. I was really moved by Obama's eulogy to John Lewis, where he says this very liberal thing that we get from our elders an imperfect society with instructions to make it better, and then hand it on to the next generation, still imperfect, but hopefully a little better. And therein lies that kind of ongoing project. And I think that on the international level is also occurring. And in some sense, in the period we've just lived through, I would say we haven't done very well in figuring out how to expand the liberal order to countries that are not fully in it. And I'll just leave it at that. But it is a welcome problem in some sense, because it's suggesting that there is something here that a larger orbit of states are trying to gain access.
John, I want to turn to where you're going in the book, which is what is the future of international liberal order? And let me tell you a sort of odd thing that occurred to me as I was reading it. We tend to think of President Trump as somebody who kind of tried to blow up the international liberal order. But I was reading, you have 5 points or sort of things that need to be reconsidered. At least the first 3 as I was going along, the following thought occurred to me. Your first is that open trade kind of need to trim the sails on that a little bit and think about trade in a more cautious way as to what effect is it having on the heartland and so forth. Second, you talk about sovereignty versus interventionism, and you say that, the impulse to intervene, noble or not, also needs to have its sails trimmed a little bit, and sovereignty is probably of greater importance than maybe liberal internationalists thought 20 or 30 years ago. And then third, you talk about open versus closed clubs, and you say, liberal democracies are probably going to have to tighten their rules a little bit about who's in their clubs and have more coherent clubs. And I started thinking, wait a minute, was Donald Trump the harbinger of the Ikenberry enlightened new liberal international order? He had that view about trade. He had that view to some extent about sovereignty and interventionism. And you could say he argued for a tightening of the bounds in clubs, make NATO pay its share and so forth, not just have all these, quote, hangers on. So was Trump the antithesis of what you think we should be heading at, or is it just a very mixed picture and I'm only pointing out?
Great challenge.
Yeah, you've really got me going here. On balance, I'm going to say no. He's not the harbinger of what I've suggested, although he is illuminating by his destructive efforts, problems that were there before him, and that are, in some sense, he took advantage of in various ways politically. But the reactionary, xenophobic rejection of America's special role in the world, the importance of international institutions, and the downplaying of human rights, the rejection of a kind of an American role in setting a vision of global community, of attention to the environment, arms control, the whole set of accomplishments that over the last 70 years have been at the heart of what America thought it was doing in the world, and what each president on the left and the right thought they were doing. Trump has attacked all of those things. And most importantly, and this is where I think your coding of Trump might not quite be right, he didn't care about the liberal community of democracies. He in fact rejected that. He was ingratiating himself to dictators and despots at the expense of Merkel and Abe and all the others who are the natural colleagues in this project. Trade, yes, there is the book is trying to say, come back to basics and don't and try to recast the narrative about trade and interdependence, that liberal internationalism will always be vulnerable to reactionary narratives if it defines itself as a project for promoting globalization. What I argue in the book is that's not what, in fact, has been the impulse. It's managing interdependence, which is not the rejection of interdependence, but it's because, in some sense, given the modernity critique of liberal internationalism, you have interdependence that's impossible to escape, but it can be managed. And I do think that in this next era, more so than in the last era, there will be there needs to be kind of a delicate attention to more managed, regulated trade, and that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be a headlong rush to protectionism and mercantilism, because if there is a kind of liberal protectionism, it's a focus on a more principled, multilateral, non-discriminatory approach, so that it's not a beggar thy neighbor return to the past. So I do think there is something there that has to be adjusted, that we're just going to have to live with that and not simply hang our hat on free trade is good and the rest of you are wrong. I think it has to be connected to how everyday people.
Yeah, Kori, I was going to ask you if you'd like to come in and offer some thoughts.
Excuse me for interrupting you, John. If I could add one quick point. I agree with everything John just said, but I do actually think President Trump is going to end up being good for the liberal international order. And you can already see it in public polls of American attitudes. Attitudes have swung by over 15 points on the three central issues, three central challenges to the international order that President Trump raised: the value of allies, the value of trade, and the value of immigration. He's brilliant at raising first order questions. Americans saw his policies and moved against them in ways that strengthened their commitment to those things. And so I think by raising those questions, President Trump has actually caused us to think anew about the value of the international order and strengthened it in that way.
Interesting, Kori. We're starting to get some questions, and we'd welcome your questions. Please send them in. Anne Florini used to be at the Carnegie Endowment, and that's an interesting question. It's a sort of two-part question, but they're related. Start with John. Is there a way to get away from the shopping mall nature of international liberal order, give it, more strategic coherence, I think, in a way? And then what are the criteria that we should now use to determine sort of who's part of that liberal global order, given that we've entered into a phase where so many countries are in a kind of gray zone between democracy and authoritarian? Is India part of the international liberal order? It's pretty illiberal in some ways. Is Turkey still a member of NATO? Not very liberal. And so there's a lot more. It isn't, this isn't the Cold War anymore. This is, three sides or two sides in a very big inchoate middle. So how do you get away from the shopping mall, give it sort of greater clarity, and where do you tend to draw the line between who's in and who's out, or is that who makes that decision? How do they make it, and so forth? John.
Yeah, that's I thank Anne for that. It's an important question. I'm sure I can't totally satisfy her on how to think about this, but I do say a little bit in the book about how to rebuild the club, and then in a foreign affairs article called "The Next Liberal Order," I go a little further and associate myself with some kind of I use the term D10, which is a kind of a code word for a post-Western larger coalition of high capacity democracies. There is a gathering actually of policy planning directors of these top 10 democracies defined in terms of high capacity functioning that meet every year, and the Atlantic Council has been involved in supporting it, and so there are a lot of smart people who've talked about how these groupings might operate, often very informally. I suggest a kind of D10, but D12. There's no magic line, but of a group of countries that could act as a kind of leadership group that can drive the reform agenda, starting with a reform of international trade rules, and then of kind of rehabilitating various multilateral institutions. Where India, I think India is definitely in a kind of loose liberal democratic world. There are countries on the edges. Brazil and Turkey would be examples. I think they're all kind of countries you would want to associate yourself with in the longer term effort to build and consolidate this grouping. I think the rise of China may actually help clarify some of this, because as the next decade or two unfolds, I think there will be more of a sense that there are two different, I'll just call it modernity projects on offer, to use Habermas's term. So some states will have to kind of decide which direction are they wanting to go, and there may be some more clarity to that. But I think this is really something that's more art than science. And I know that Biden has talked about a gathering of democracies. It will be a very tricky, delicate matter to know who to invite. Maybe it has to be a self-initiated invitation. But the key point is that in some configuration, we want to rebuild the salience of a kind of liberal democratic world that has things in common, that we know historically have in working together done important things that we all want to continue doing. So it's a kind of process of coalition building and maintenance that under the banner of a kind of liberal democratic world, and the details I think are going to have to be negotiated.
Kori, you were associated with Senator McCain's 2008 presidential campaign, and one of the ideas in his campaign was an alliance of democracies. I remember I used to talk about it with my colleague at the time, Bob Kagan. He was very interested in that idea, and we discussed it. Do you think, is that the same idea then as what John is talking about? Do you think that President-elect Biden, once in power, should pursue some kind of club, larger G7, alliance for democracy? Or is that an idea that no longer fits?
I think it's a great idea. And the way to advance it is by identifying common work we want to do together. For example, one of the best ideas I have heard is to have democracies willing to regulate their economies in ways that protect the climate. So have the Alliance of Democracies create a standard in which they tax more highly the imports of countries that do not protect climate. Those kinds, it's a challenge that doesn't have an institutional home, that needs one, that all of the advanced democracies are under public pressure to do something about. It's an area ripe for the kind of cooperation that John talks about.
Interesting. One critique I've heard, John, of the international liberal order sort of going forward, people say, well, it was an idea of a time, but the way the world is now, some of the global governance challenges that we face, like climate change, dealing with migrants and refugees and others, as you note in the book, are not only to be solved by democracies. All major states or all states are affected by them and are going to need to work together. But some people might take that thought a step further and say, actually, the most important issues are now ones that everybody's going to need to work together on. So therefore, dividing the world into an alliance of democracies and then trying to have a broader international order, you're going to alienate the very people you need to work with. And so has global governance shifted in some ways so that the major issues are sort of outside the purview, and given the shrinking relative economic share that the liberal democracies have in the world compared to others, et cetera? Or do you somehow square that circle by saying you can do both at the same time?
More the latter. I do think that many of the great challenges of modernity, as I cast the issue, are global problems, not least pandemics and climate change. Well, the big three are pandemics, climate change, and WMD proliferation. And those are global problems that implicate all of us. So that's true. I guess what I would say is that we do want to be able to to work at different levels, and there are things that we need to do globally. The UN and the Westphalian Order provides a kind of platform where it's not cooperation is not based on regime type, but the international order is a zone of interaction where we want to do a lot of different things at the same time. We want to do that. We want to solve security problems of a global nature, but we also want to protect values we care about. For me, when I think about what at the end of the 20th century, what values embedded in a critical mass of countries would we want to have protected so that our children and grandchildren can have a chance of entering the next century in a kind of survivable way. And for me, the single most important value would be civil societies that are outside the reach of despotic states. After that, rule of law, freedom of information and speech. These are sort of things that we can't sort of put on the side as we try to stabilize interdependence. So I think we have to do both at the same time.
Okay, I've got a lot of good questions here, so I'm going to come back to you, John. Chris McLennan from Canada asked a very interesting question, which I want to combine with another one of those puzzling thoughts that I had. Chris asks, what role for smaller democracies, Norway, Canada, Australia, important countries, but not the major democratic powers, how do they play a positive role in engendering an international liberal order? And that relates to a question of, in a sense, your analysis, reading it, I think it's very, U.S. oriented. Could it be, this is a bit of a counterintuitive thought, that the weakening of U.S. power in relative terms in recent years, as well as the damage the U.S. is inflicting on itself as a model to others, makes international liberal order more possible because it deconcentrates. And so a Brazil that 15 years ago might have felt like we don't want to be part of some U.S.-led order that's going to go around invading Iraq and such, or even France and Germany that were pretty uncomfortable with that. They can say, okay, as long as it's not a U.S.-dominated thing, we might have a real seat at the table. This I could get interested in. So is it paradoxically that a weaker U.S., rather than just saying the U.S. has to lead a global international liberal order, it's all dependent upon U.S. leadership and power, it's actually the reverse?
That's a great question. I think a powerful America is good for the liberal order, ultimately, properly, with a kind of enlightened American self-interest, which we've seen for many decades. But there is something to that insight, and indeed the book is partly trying to tell the story of liberal internationalism to somewhat separate it from different things, from Woodrow Wilson as a person, from American hegemony. So I'm trying to send a message in the book that the ideas are bigger than any one country. So in that sense, I agree with the first part of the argument, and in some sense put myself in somewhat of a debate with somebody like Robert Kagan, who thinks that when America goes down, liberal order disappears. So I'm making a slightly different argument that there is a constituency out there for it. I think of South Korea. I think of larger array of middle countries. There's this alliance for multilateralism that I think Germany and France launched, and I've heard the Korean foreign minister speak eloquently about the role of middle power states like South Korea. who in some sense have a more exquisite sense of why a liberal order is good, because it really matters in a very practical, hard-headed way for the kinds of environments these smaller states live in and try to navigate within. So I think there is a unrealized potential for wider coalitions and a more humble America that now has shown the world that it doesn't have all the answers, and in fact it needs the other countries as much as they need it. I think there's something there that can be worked with.
Kori, do you
So
want
if I may jump in,
Yeah, please do.
I'm wrapping up my sleeve at this because I want to quote you John Ikenberry, who in his earlier writings, I think has given exactly the right answer to this, which is that the liberal order's ultimate success would be that it didn't rely on American power to enforce it, that the norms and the institutions and the comportment of states in the order was adequate to carry it. But we are unfortunately not yet there. And that's why the activism, the big advantage of liberal internationalism is it's the first time a hegemon has had voluntary cooperation from other powers. Precisely for the reason John said, the middle powers and the small states are the main beneficiaries of the international order because they don't have the power to enforce their preferences.
Well, they're certainly the ones who've felt the most pain when President Trump has damaged the alliance relationships because they feel what they're missing, Germany, Canada, et cetera, very acutely. One question that comes from a very different angle, John, Richard Caputo asks, so what role, if any, do multinational companies have in the international liberal order? And again, one can think of a dualism here. On one hand, the companies are part of they enjoy a free trade approach. They like the openness and freedom of the international liberal order. Or one could say, no, they're simply functional actors that will take whatever they can in terms of investment opportunities, capital flows. They're totally politically neutral. They're just simply functional operators that will adapt to any system that you give them. Where do you put, you're very state-centric in at least your initial way of describing this, which is completely normal. But where does this, enormous private business side of internationalism fit with your conception?
Yeah, well, within the liberal international tradition, trade and investment across borders realized by firms is at the heart of how we got from the beginning of the 19th century to a interdependent world dominated by liberal democracies at the end of the 20th century. So they have been part of the great revolutions in the global system, and obviously, it cuts both ways in terms of how they've both benefited and imperiled liberal democracies or countries that have sought to transition in that direction. They are at various moments constituencies for open rule-based order, but they are also complicit in the often technologically driven imbalancing of these societies. I think of the argument of Danny Roderick, who suggests that in the current phase of globalization driven by these firms, greater levels of integration have had less benefits through efficiency and growth than further skewing inequality within these societies. So it cuts both ways, Tom, and I think we're kind of at this moment where we're hoping that there will be especially when we think about carbon neutral goals of our societies, that at some point there's a kind of moment when there's a critical mass of firms that start to see their interest in moving in that direction towards investment within and between countries in technologies that move us to the next energy phase. So I think it's a kind of mixed story, as I would tell it.
Understood. We have 4 minutes left. I want to squeeze in one more question and give you both a chance. Gaurav Bansal asks, what role will emerging organizations like ASEAN or the African Union play in your conception of an international liberal order? It's hard not, I think, for some readers, viewers to think, yeah, basically he's still at heart just wants a Western club and the rest of us are on the periphery. We might get in if we behave well, but somehow we're not really part of his conception, but we don't want to be part of a China-led order. We have other interests. And is there really a role for both regional organizations and non-Western actors in your conception?
Kori, do you want to stab at that first?
Sure, I'll be glad to. Absolutely, there is. That it's the free world isn't just the West, and the conveyors of the liberal international order don't require Western anchors to succeed. That societies choosing to shield themselves against the threats that modernity creates need norms, institutions, international cooperation to help manage them. And ASEAN and the African Union aren't yet the equivalent of, say, NATO or the equivalent of the G8, but they absolutely have important roles to play. I think the African Union has actually done a better job than ASEAN has done in the sense of holding its states accountable to emergent norms. I think ASEAN struggles because it's larger and more diverse, and those are always challenges for institutionalization. But I think the more we help foster those institutions and set them up to be successful, the more robust and resilient the international order will be.
Thank you, Kori. John, we just have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to cut you off if you go past that because we promised the viewers just one hour. So you want to add a thought on that and just closing thought, things you haven't gotten to, and then we'll finish with you. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I agree with Kori on that there is a role for these regional institutions. And I would say that the promise of a healthy, functioning liberal international order is that it provides an alternative to geopolitically driven spheres of influence, a kind of return to a 21st century imperial order. And that kind of division of the world into spheres of influence and imperial zones is a real danger to these fragile regional systems. And I think they should hope, and we should hope, that there is a kind of surviving international order that's built around principles like multilateralism and reciprocity and all those features that we associate with liberal order, so that there is a kind of global platform that will allow regional experiments to succeed and not be coerced and disrupted by great power geopolitical projects. And then finally, on a more general note, one of the arguments I make in the book is precisely this argument about liberal democracies as not powerful billiard balls like realists would have it, but more like orchids that are fragile flowers that need a terrarium or need a greenhouse. And in some sense, that's the liberal order. It's the construction of an ecosystem to allow our societies that we now know more than we did even 10 years ago are more vulnerable and fragile than we thought. And that's true for the big powers like the United States. It's also true for ASEAN countries and African countries that have a lot they want to do over the next generation, and they can hope for an open rule-based order because the alternative will limit rather than open up their possibilities.
Acemoglu and Robinson's new book is in fact about the fragility of democracy historically and how it is really an unusual set of circumstances that allows freedom to thrive in a society given all of the pressures in other directions. John Ikenberry, Kori Schake, terrific conversation. I hope we've whetted your appetite for a great book, A World Safe for Democracy, and a set of issues that's very much upon us today. And we're all the better for your work, John, on it, and wish you the best with it. Kori, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all again at another Carnegie event. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.